Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Doing Well, the Wellbeing Science Insights Podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Doing Well, where we talk about all things well-being. And on this week's episode, we are going to talk about morbid curiosity, confronting the upcoming threats. Now, I have to say, I'm not a big fan of morbid curiosity as I started to read upon the topic. I know a lot of people on our team actually are fans of true crime podcasts. I'm not one of them. But today I'm going to be keen to find out why this topic is so fascinating. And there's a book coming out, about this topic by our guest of the day. And I would love to introduce our guest and get him to introduce himself in a bit. Coltan Scrivner is a behavioral scientist at the Recreational Fear Lab at Aarhus University and in the Department of Psychology at Arizona State University. He is an expert on the psychology of morbid curiosity, including our fascination with topics like true crime and scary stories. He is currently writing his first book, Morbidly Curious, which will be published by Penguin Books in 2025. Welcome to the show, Coltan.
Thank you. Happy to be on.
Yeah, as I said, I'm really excited to learn more about this topic because I'm not one of those people that actively search for true crime stories. I think the latest addition to my wealth of knowledge about this topic is probably the documentary, The Tinder Swindler, or was it the documentary or a movie? I can't remember anymore. Just because so many friends raved about it and I was like, I have to watch this. So I'm really curious why you got into this field of work and how you got here to write a book about it. And I love the name of the book, by the way. It's really fun wordplay.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I certainly didn't go into grad school thinking that I was going to study morbid curiosity. I spent the first year or so exploring a lot of different topics, like many Ph.D. students do. And one of the questions that I came across that I thought was interesting was why people are across history have seemed to be interested in violence as a sport or as an entertainment. If you think of the Colosseum is probably the most famous example, but we have lots of modern examples too, with like boxing or mixed martial arts or even certain sports like football are fairly violent, right? And so it seems like there's something about violence when it's in the right context that people find it not just morally acceptable, but entertaining. And so I became interested in how people sort of distinguish violence that's okay to watch and violence that's not okay to watch. And so I did a study or two on that very early in my PhD. And then I started thinking, well, it's also kind of interesting that people scare themselves for fun. They expose themselves to these things that they generally try to avoid. You generally try to avoid violence. You generally try to avoid things that scare you. But in certain cases, you expose yourself to it. And you may even pay a cost to do it, right? You buy a ticket to a haunted house or a scary movie or a boxing match. And so I started looking around to see, who was doing research on this topic. And it turned out that almost nobody was doing research on this topic, at least not in psychology. And so I reached out to one person who was a literature scholar who was interested in this. And he and I worked together on a haunted house study. So there's a haunted attraction. He lives in Denmark. He's a professor there at Aarhus University, which is why I'm affiliated with Aarhus as well. And he and I and a couple of his other colleagues did a study at a haunted attraction to see why people scared themselves for fun. And so I kind of, throughout the years, sort of combined those together into this topic of morbid curiosity.
That is fascinating. And I still don't understand why people get into scary things either, because me, I actively avoid these things. And I think actually now you mentioned haunted house. Last time I went to this Halloween I think it was not a party per se, but it was like a Halloween event at a theme park, and accidentally walked into a haunted train because no one was at the queue. So my friends and I were just like, oh, there's no queue. Let's go in, see what's that's about. And we just kept our eyes
Right.
closed the whole time. But it was thrilling for sure. It is something that we talked about and we laughed at. But I still don't get why others seek the thrill of morbid curiosity. So we'll find out today in our podcast recording. And before we get into that part, we have a part we called Have You Met Coltan? So we're going to get to know you a little bit better through some of your favorite items that we have here. We have 5 things. And the first one, I love asking this question, is what's your favorite book?
Ooh, my favorite book. I think it kind of depends what I'm interested in at the time. When I research a topic, I spend a lot of time, reading books that are related to that. And so I think my favorite kind of shifts depending on what I'm reading or what I'm researching at any given moment. Probably my most recent favorite book. Oh, actually, you know what? One that's kind of been my favorite for a while. It's called The Ethnobiology of the Haitian Zombie. I think it was re-released as a more popular science book called The Serpent and the Rainbow. And it's about an anthropologist who goes to Haiti, and he discovers, what's the actual biology behind what they call zombies, right? So they have Haitian folklores who turn people into zombies, and they use a special recipe to do so. And so he sort of uncovers like what's in this recipe, why might it turn people into something like a zombie, and kind of what's the folklore around it.
Interesting. Yeah, I've definitely never heard of that before. As I said, I don't actively seek the thrills in those kinds of stories. So good to hear that recommendation. And that's on theme with this topic as well. Now, what about a movie? Would it be a zombie movie too?
My favorite, my favorite movies are probably the Indiana Jones trilogy. I don't know which between the 3, but that trilogy has always been my favorite since I was a kid.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this on this show. Now, you're our podcast guest, and I wonder if you personally listen to podcasts yourself, and if you do, which one is your favorite?
I'm not really a podcast listener, actually. I don't have a commute, and I think podcasts are pretty good if you have a commute.
Yeah, true.
When I go on road trips, I will sometimes listen to podcasts. I'm trying to think of one that might go to that I listen to if I have a long trip. Very Bad Wizards is one that I usually listen to if I have a long road trip and I haven't, listened in a while. It's kind of a podcast about moral psychology and moral philosophy, but it's sort of comedic. The hosts are very funny and very, very smart and witty, and always talk about really interesting topics.
That's a fun one and a new one for me as well. Thank you for that. And I know that in the agenda we sent you, we sort of said famous role model, but I like to tweak the question a little bit and ask you, who's your role model? Now, this can be a famous figure, could be someone in your network, in your personal life, or some of our guests actually talk about a fictional character. So who would that be for you?
Not really much of a role model person. I don't know if I've had anyone that I've looked up to and tried to emulate, or it's just never been my approach to things, really. When I was in college, so there was a scientist that kind of got me interested in some of the things I'm interested in now. So when I was in college, I read a lot of Robert Sapolsky's articles and books, and I liked him a lot because he was trained in anthropology, which is what I was studying at the time, but also integrated a lot of neuroscience and biology in his work, which is also what I was doing. And so he was one of the few scientists that I saw that was kind of doing that. So he was probably one of my role models early in my career.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And again, a new thing for me to learn today, a new person. So thank you for sharing. And the last question in this part would be about a course. Now, I know that you've done a lot of research on your book. Not sure if you've actually taken any course recently. Might be something that you took a long time ago, but if there's something that really stood out and really influenced your work, what would that course be?
That influenced my work. So a lot of the work I do is published in psychology journals. The conferences I go to and present at are typically psychology or psychology adjacent, but I'm actually not trained in psychology. And so I would have to say that some of the courses that influence how I think now are actually the biology courses that I took throughout school. I don't know if I have a specific one, but taking things like genetics or developmental biology or microbiology, I think gave me a different perspective on human behavior than a classically trained psychologist has. And so I think about questions related to human behavior like a biologist would think about them, for an animal. And so I think it gives me a slightly different perspective than a classically trained psychologist. So, classes like genetics or microbiology or developmental biology have definitely influenced, the way I think.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Now, we've covered 5 questions, as I mentioned. We've got to know you a whole heap better. And I think from my perspective, it's kind of interesting because I hear your answers, and very similar to other guests, it's quite on brand. It's really aligned with what you're doing. Nothing sort of like, outstanding there that, whoa, that's definitely not something we thought you would like. And I learned a few new things today. So thank you for that. And since we've got to know you better, let's talk about today's topic, which is morbid curiosity. Once again, like I've never heard these terms in my life. So it's going to be fun. And since the show is about well-being, let's put it into context. Now, to you, Coltan, what does well-being mean?
I think it has to do with having enough of the things that are valuable to you. So if you have good well-being, high well-being, you have enough of the things that are valuable to you. And that could be, and usually is a combination of a lot of things, whether it's economic resources, social resources, social network connections, a job or a career that you enjoy, a family, things, just whatever is important to you, that you have enough of that in your life that you're content with it, happy with it, and you enjoy it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as I mentioned, this is my first recording of the year. And obviously, as the new year enters, a lot of people have been reflecting on their well-being and other things in their lives. They would agree with your approach. Because over the holiday, I just read up a lot on this topic and, not proactively, but just things that show up on my feed that kind of related to this. And one of the things that I also read in one of the books that I've been reading recently was about exactly that. It's not about having a lot, but it's having what is right for you and thinking that you have enough. Once you accept and think that you have enough, then your well-being is in balance. But I think we feel out of balance when we start to look for more. And I guess that's kind of the biggest lesson that I learned recently. And sometimes we just have to relearn these lessons as we go, I guess, because the show is about well-being. And I think I say this every single episode, but for our audience, I guess it helps, in case this is the first time they are tuning into this podcast, or maybe the 100th time, it helps still. So that is well-being for us. And I'm now wondering, since you have your own perception of well-being, what do you think what are some of the things that people actually get wrong when it comes to well-being? This can be from your personal observation, could be from a research that you read somewhere. What would be some of those misconceptions?
I think maybe one of the things is that people only seek out easy experiences, thinking that those will be the ones that make them happy. And that's not always what contributes the most to your well-being or to flourishing in general, right? Overcoming challenging things or difficult times of your life, or just challenging yourself with something scary, for example, can lead to well-being that's difficult to attain, if you just take the easy route all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely a good point. And, speaking of challenging yourself with scary things, let's talk about morbid curiosity. I know you briefly mentioned this in the intro when you talked about your work and your upcoming book, but to our audience who, just like me, they are finding this term to be something extremely new and sort of hard to understand. How would you break down the concept of morbid curiosity in simple terms?
Yeah, well, one of the misconceptions that I do hear is that people assume that it's a bad thing to have. The name, the descriptor morbid, like in a medical context, usually means something bad, right? But in this case, it really just refers to the topic of the curiosity. The topic is something that's bad, right? The thing you're interested in is something that's dangerous or a threat or scary. But the curiosity itself is not bad. So in the simplest terms, when I use the phrase morbid curiosity, I'm just referring to an interest in something that is potentially threatening. And that could lead you to gather information about it through fictional stories or true crime or maybe a haunted house or any number of things that expose you to this scary thing, typically in a fairly safe way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And why would we consider that to be an aspect of our well-being? Because, we were kind of defining well-being earlier, right? We were kind of saying we seek things that are, sort of good for our well-being, and we don't necessarily need to seek things that are just things that people want us to go for when it comes to well-being. Morbid curiosity is probably one of those things. No one will tell you, hey, why don't you go to a haunted house to improve your well-being? So how does morbid curiosity actually affect and impact our well-being, perhaps from your perspective, I think in a positive way?
Yeah, well, maybe they should recommend that sometimes. So one of the more interesting studies that I did was during the pandemic. And a group of colleagues and I were interested in whether or not people who were morbidly curious were actually doing better during the pandemic, because our idea was that these people had played with scary things, for most of their lives. They've watched scary movies, or they go to haunted houses, or they sort of allow themselves to feel anxious, feel afraid, and then practice overcoming that in a kind of playful setting, right? Mm-hmm. In the same way that like a dog or a cat might play with another dog or cat and chase them. And it's kind of this thrilling experience, but they're actually learning something valuable from that. And so we did this study to see, okay, are people in the very early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, this was in, I think, April of 2020, when we did this study, we looked at psychological resilience during those months. And then we looked at people who were morbidly curious, like high levels of morbid curiosity or low levels of morbid curiosity. And what we found were that people who were morbidly curious actually had more positive resilience during the early months of the pandemic. And in a follow-up study, I think it was a month or 2 months later, their resilience stayed higher than people who were lower in morbid curiosity. And so I think as it relates to well-being, it could be the case that exposing yourself to things that are somewhat scary and then practicing overcoming those feelings of anxiety, those feelings of fear, can actually give you a bit of a resilience boost, right? Which can lead to higher well-being, especially in stressful contexts in the real world.
That is interesting. I think that makes sense now that you sort of break it down and explain how people who got exposed to these, let's just say, scary things in the pandemic, they coped better. Now, I wasn't one of those people. I coped fine. I guess I just had different, coping mechanism. But since we were kind of jokingly saying maybe they should recommend this to people, I have a scenario for you. And this just came out because I've been thinking about this quite a bit. What I have found is a lot of people that I talk to, this could be colleagues, friends, when they're having a really stressful time in their lives, this could be related to their job, their personal lives. They don't necessarily want to go through anything of the scary, sphere. They just want to have like a lighthearted time, maybe watch a comedy show or, like just go out and do something fun. They probably don't want to sit down and, focus their energy on, maybe listening to a true crime podcast or going to a haunted house. So would you say that this is something that would depend on their circumstance? Because we probably won't recommend, hey, why don't you go to a haunted house to every single person we meet to help them improve their well-being? I guess it depends on the context.
Sure. I mean, like anything else in human behavior, it depends on the individual, depends on the context. But I think there's some data actually against that anecdote. So, I mean, during the pandemic, which arguably was a very scary time for most people, especially the first year of it, whether you were afraid of the lockdowns or the virus or whatever it is, everybody was a little bit afraid of something. Horror movies had their best year at the box office in history. So more people were going out and watching scary movies than they ever had before, at least on record, right?
Right.
And it happened again in 2021. So there was a huge spike in interest in scary media during a time where people's lives were very scary. And there's some interesting evidence from there's an old study from, I think it was the late 90s or early 2000s. A group of researchers set up outside of a movie store back when movie rental stores were still a thing.
Yeah.
And they surveyed people as they came in. They asked them how they were feeling. Are you feeling happy or sad or angry or anxious or whatever? And then the people would go in and they would rent their movies, and they would come out and they would ask them, oh, okay, well, what movie did you rent, or what movies did you rent? And they were expecting, I think, what you just said, which is that people would essentially rent something that's consistent with what they're feeling. If they're feeling happy, they're going to go in and rent a comedy or something. And if they're feeling angry, they might rent a violent movie. If they're feeling sad, maybe they rent a romance movie or a rom-com or sort of a sad or sadder movie. But what they found was that, they were expecting the opposite of that. And what they found was that people who were feeling a certain way actually rented movies that were consistent with that. So, and this was the most true for horror movies. So people who came in and were feeling nervous or feeling anxious at that time when they walked in the store actually ended up renting horror movies more than any other movie. They were more likely to rent something that would, that you wouldn't think they would rent, right? Because it would be, you would think they would want to get rid of that feeling, but that's not always the case. And, or it's not always the case that watching or experiencing something that's the opposite of what you're feeling will help you get over it. Sometimes watching or experiencing something that's similar to what you're feeling can help you get over it. And I think anecdotally, you hear this a lot, or I've heard it a lot, which is that, if you're feeling sad, you do listen to like sad songs, right? A lot of people listen to, like, after a breakup, they'll go listen to breakup songs. They don't listen to happy songs, right? And so there's something to this idea of, sort of simulating an experience where you can feel those emotions, but they're not impacting you personally, right? And you kind of learn how to work through those in this simulated form in a way that's much easier than working through it without that sort of aid there.
That is fascinating to me, at least. I don't know if our audience can relate, but to me, the songs part, I relate to that definitely. Like after every single breakup, you listen to breakup songs for sure. But I think it's interesting that we were saying, you know what, a lot of people are actually seeking movies or, experience that reflect how they're feeling. Not because it's not about escaping that. It sounds like they're gaining insights from that. And so to kind of go into this in a bit more detail, I'm sure, in your book, you might mention this. How do they actually gain insights from doing such activities?
Yeah, well, some of it is wanting to escape it too, but sometimes the best way to escape something is to kind of go through it rather than avoid it, right? So for example, one of the more interesting things that I've found that was even, at least initially, was surprising to me was that people who score a bit higher in measures of anxiety are actually more likely to be fans of scary movies, which again, you wouldn't really expect. You would think that people who are very low in anxiety are the people who would go in and watch a scary movie because they can kind of handle the fear or the anxiety that's produced from that. But what it seems like is actually people who are anxious seek out those scary things. And it kind of makes sense now if you think about it, because if you think about what anxiety really does, it causes you to be more vigilant towards potential threats.
Right.
Well, that would include potential threats in movies, right? So you'd be more vigilant and more attentive to movies that have a very obvious threat in them. So they sit down, let's say you're feeling anxious, you sit down, you turn on a scary movie, you're still feeling anxious, right? You're still watching the movie and you're still feeling anxious. But now maybe you're feeling anxious because of something that's happening in the movie. Maybe it's a thriller and you're feeling anxious or nervous about the protagonist. But it's kind of a clever trick there. What that allows you to do then is actually adjust how intense that feeling is. So if I'm sitting at home and I'm nervous about a job interview that I have, coming up in a week or something, there's not really much I can do to quell my anxiety, right? I'm just going to feel anxious about that. I can't do something to turn that down, right? But if I turn on a scary movie, I'm still feeling anxious. Now your mind is kind of attaching that anxiety to something in the movie. And what you can do then is actually, you have a bit of control over it, because now you can pause the movie, you can turn the volume down, you can turn the lights on, you can watch it with someone else. You can do all of these things that allow you to dampen how scary the movie is to you, which in return sort of dampens that physiological feeling that you have, or the feeling that you have to the physiological changes that occur when you're feeling anxious. And then after 90 minutes or so, the movie ends and you kind of get this parasympathetic nervous system activation that actually relaxes you a little bit. And so it's kind of like transferring your anxiety a bit, or your feelings of anxiety a bit, from whatever thing is bothering you in the real world to a fictional world where you have a bit more control over it. And over time, you actually learn how to then, because during this time you're practicing, dampening that feeling of anxiety, right? Or maybe reframing it, or doing all these things that cognitive behavioral therapy teaches you to do. And over time, you're essentially just practicing those skills. And so when you experience something scary in the real world, at least for some people, it seems, they're able to then use those skills that they sort of practiced when they were watching a scary movie or going through a haunted house and actually use them to help, dampen or leave feelings of anxiety about real things in the real world.
That is interesting for sure, because as I told you, I'm so new to this. I'm not sure if our audience is the same, but I'm like, why would I do that? And I think the coping strategy here is quite important. Like, I feel like I personally have a different coping strategy because, every time I feel anxious or stressed, I watch The Big Bang Theory for the 13th time, pretty much. Like,
Right.
I just do that. But now that you
But
mention
if it works for you, then that's fine, right?
yeah,
Like, there are many different coping strategies that people can employ.
yeah.
And the important thing is finding something that works for you, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But on the other hand, I also think that what you're saying makes a lot of sense because personally, I think this is something new. Maybe I can try. I still don't have to do it all the time, but maybe I can try this instead. Because as I mentioned to you at the beginning of the show, I did watch The Tinder Swindler. And after that, I was kind of like, I would never put myself in such a situation. I don't use dating apps. So that's not the thing that I have to kind of look out for. But somehow after watching that, I was kind of like, I feel safer for some weird reason. I was just like, oh, like this is not a fun story to follow, obviously, but I feel safer knowing this information. And yeah, and recently, over the holiday, I didn't have much to do. Now it's just coming back to me, and I started to watch TV again. I watched this zombies TV show, the Korean one, the Kingdom one. I'm sure a lot of people know about these shows, and it helps because it's so scary, but it's kind of fun. Like, because I love zombie stuff. I just haven't been getting back into them. And then now that I'm getting back into the zombies world, I'm like, I don't know, like I feel safer in our world. And, like, in a way, this sounds funny, but in a way I feel grateful because, it's a story that is so scary. And those people just live scared, like in this world where they just don't know what's going to come next. And they don't know if they can actually survive the next 2 minutes. And I feel safe and I feel grateful for my life, as funny as it sounds.
No, I think that's a normal feeling, right? I think it's easy to get consumed in our life. Most of us, like most of your listeners, I assume as well, like have, compared to the rest of human history, have pretty cushy lives, right? Like compared to our ancestors 10,000 years ago or even 100 years ago, our lives aren't so bad. We still have our own things that make us feel anxious, our own things that worry us or might impact our well-being in negative ways. But when you allow yourself to then think about or watch a scary movie or watch a zombie movie, for example, and see like, oh, well, these people have it much worse and they're still getting through it just fine, right? It kind of gives you an example of how resilient people can be.
Yeah.
And I think it does make you feel a little bit grateful that your problems, despite making you feel bad, are maybe not as bad as they could be.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's exactly the point, which is why I'm slowly processing the information you gave me in a sense that, what, maybe instead of watching The Big Bang Theory, I can actually go for something a little bit scarier. And I guess that helps from time to time because at the end of the day, we're learning this new information, and I'm sure our audience too, so that they can employ new strategies in their daily lives. And this is probably something that a lot of people like myself just don't go for quite naturally. So if they have this information, perhaps they can try it. Now, I have a final question in this part because I know that you have a book coming out next year, and obviously we don't want to have too much spoiler, but I am curious because obviously this is a new topic and it's quite different from what you hear, what you see at the bookstore. If you can throw in some fun fact about morbid curiosity or, maybe some things that we didn't get to cover that might make it to your book or might not make it to your book, that would be really fun for us.
Yeah. I can give you a sense of kind of what I talk about in the book, some of the chapters. So a lot of my work has looked at morbid curiosity as this multifaceted construct. So, right, there's sort of the overarching morbid curiosity, but then you have these facets. And some people are more interested in things like true crime, for example, but maybe less interested in things like violence. Some people may be more interested in something like body disgust, or like surgery videos are weirdly popular, right? But they may not be interested in something like boxing or mixed martial arts. And so there are 4 chapters that go over sort of those 4 facets, which are curiosity about violence, curiosity about the intentions or motivations of dangerous people, curiosity about the body and sort of the limits of the body, and curiosity about sort of the unknown or paranormal. So it kind of explains, why these four and how that feeds into this larger construct. I've got a chapter on nightmares, which is one that I didn't initially expect to put in the book, but as I started doing more reading and more writing about it, I saw how it fit really well with a lot of the stuff I was talking about. Got chapters on kind of what we just talked about, how you could maybe use scary play to build resilience and actually become less anxious. And I have a chapter on kids and how kids are actually pretty morbidly curious, maybe more so than most adults. And then how that, contrary to what it seems, may actually be good for their development in some ways. So it kind of covers a broad range of things, from sort of old evolutionary, like looking at animals and morbid curiosity in animals, to the different kinds we see in humans and how it might help us, and how we see it from children to older adults, and some of the misconceptions that people have about it, based on things they've heard in the news or read in in magazines or something like that.
Very interesting. Well, thank you for giving us a window into what the book is going to be about. And I'm sure our audience, whoever is interested in this topic, will, find that book. I know I'm going to subscribe for sure. So, I'll ask you to share maybe where we can find out more about the book later in a little bit. For now, let's go into something a bit more practical for our audience, because, we always have this section for practice. People might start to wonder, okay, what am I supposed to practice here? Like, how do I even practice morbid curiosity? As I said, this might be something that come naturally to a lot of people. My best friend loves horror movies. I'm just like, whoa, okay, you go do that with your other friends. but some people might find this to be a new thing that they want to pick up or try, just to kind of like improve their resilience, like you were saying earlier. So what would be a practice you recommend to our audience? Maybe this is something you do yourself to maybe improve the way that we approach morbid curiosity.
I think some people jump in initially thinking that they need to find something incredibly scary, right? Like and that's not the way to do it, right? It's not about how scary something is necessarily. It's just, you need something that scares you a little bit, right? Something that gets you out of your comfort zone a little bit. And that's wildly different for different people. For your friend, that might be a really scary movie or a haunted house or something. For you, it might be a book that's a little bit scary, right? It's easy to put a book down. It takes more work to vividly imagine a book than it does to watch something on your TV. And so, if I would say that the easiest way to slide into it, if you're, not very comfortable with scary things, is to start with something like a podcast, or start with something like a book that is easy to pause or put down, and requires a bit more effort to conjure up, these vivid mental images of what might be going on. I think, some people, again, just jump into like a really scary, they look up like top 10 scariest movies and they jump into one of those. And that's not really the way to do it, because then it might be too much and it's more than you are able to handle. And then it kind of, one thing that I hear a lot is people who don't like scary movies as adults is they say, well, I watched a scary movie as a kid and it was just way too much and I just avoided them from then on out. And I think this, that can happen as an adult too. So if they had been, started with something a little bit softer, a little bit lighter, that may not have happened, right? So I would say ease yourself into it, right? Don't necessarily go with whatever the scariest movie of the year is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely a great recommendation. I think the book front is something that our audience can potentially try. And that reminds me of something very funny. I'm just going to throw in this practice. If anyone has watched Friends, I remember this scene where Joey reads The Shining, and whenever it's scary, he just puts it in the freezer, the book.
Yeah.
And I think that is something we can do. If the book gets really scary, put it in the freezer and then come back to it later. So
Well,
that's
good.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah, and that actually gives you a chance. If it gets too, because books can be really scary, right? A very good author can create really vivid, atmospheres in a book. But what it allows you to do is then you can set it down. It's not bombarding your visual senses, right? You can set it down and you can actually calm yourself down. You're practicing those emotion regulation skills when you do that, right? So books are a great way to do that, because it does allow you. I mean, in movies you can pause or kind of like turn the TV off for a minute and regain your calm and collect yourself a little bit, and then turn it back on when you're ready, right? And that allows you to practice those emotion regulation skills that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So I think we have already talked about the fact that, trying these activities, maybe just something of a smaller scale or something that is not way too much for you, whoever is listening, can help to build resilience. Now, that's one part of the, behavioral difference that you sort of mentioned earlier in the show. But for anyone who's still hesitant to pick up something scary or something of, morbid curiosity, what would you say to encourage them? Maybe this can be, a character strength, that something different from resilience that people develop, or it could just be behavioral differences that you notice in people when you're researching for this book.
Yeah. One of the more interesting things that I found about people who are not interested in horror typically, or are very afraid of it, right? They tend to. So when we do haunted house studies, we always ask people, "Did you come here because you wanted to come here, or did you come here because your friend or partner wanted to come here?" And there's usually a clear split. There's some people who wanted to go, and then there's some people who came because their friends wanted them to go or wanted to go, right? And they kind of are like, "Okay, I'll go with you." Typically, those people are more scared of the haunt. They're typically more hesitant to go in. But when they come out, they're also more likely to say that they learned something about themselves and that they feel more self-reliant. They feel like they have a better sense of what they're able to handle and not able to handle. So in addition to, I would say, resilience, you also build this feeling of like self-efficacy, that you're able to overcome these things, which is related to resilience in a lot of ways. But I think then it gives you kind of a confidence to approach other things that might be scary. They're unrelated to true crime or horror. It might be, applying for a new job, or starting a new business, or doing something that's just scary in a different kind of way.
Yeah, that's definitely a great point to convince people. There you go, your audience. If you're still hesitant to try and pick up something scary or something of still sounds a little bit morbid, I think it helps. And self-efficacy, I think, is one of the topics that we have covered on this show or the happiness show before. I just do two shows, so I get confused sometimes. But we'll try to link all the resources in the show notes. That sounds really fun. And thank you for sharing that. I think it has been eye-opening for me because, as I said, I actively avoid these things. And now that you mention it, I think I will be a bit more open-minded to kind of seek these things once in a while so that I can build that resilience. Last part of this podcast, we've come to the end. And we've got open mic. As I mentioned to you earlier in the show, this is your platform to talk about anything you would like to talk about. And obviously, we would love for you to share, any social media handles you have, maybe your website and places people can subscribe to your newsletter to find out more about your book when it comes out before we let you go.
Sure. Yeah. A couple things come to mind. So my website is just www.coltanscrivner.com. And on there, I have, if you're interested in the actual research behind some of the stuff I've talked about, I have all of my academic articles available there. You can just download the PDFs. I also have, other interviews I've done, which kind of break them down in a more digestible, short way. This interview will go on there as soon as it's available. I have, popular science pieces I've written. So kind of if you're interested in this topic, there's a lot of stuff on my website that would kind of introduce you to the basic ideas that we've discussed a bit in more detail. I also have a link to my Substack where I write about these kinds of things at length, and I talk about a lot of the stuff that will be in the book and a lot of stuff that I wanted to be in the book that didn't make it, but I still find very interesting. I write about there. For example, a couple of the recent posts I've been publishing on my Substack have to do with why horror villains sort of look and act the way they do, because there's a lot of ways you could make a villain, but we have these very specific ways that we tend to make them. And so I break that down and think about things that I may not have evidence for yet, but I think might be right. And that's kind of where I publish those ideas. That's where you should go if you want to find out more about what I do. I also do so I live in, the town I live in has an annual Halloween festival, and it's a big zombie festival, and I actually organize it, which is super fun because I get to do a lot of these things that I'm interested in, but in a very non-academic way, right? It has nothing to do with academia or publishing papers or anything like that. It's just a fun way for people thousands of people come dressed as zombies and kind of go through the town all day dressed as zombies. And there's the music and festivals and vendors, all kinds of fun stuff, but it's all people engaging in this like scary play, right? A very safe way. And what's interesting is people always ask me, is it kid friendly? And I say, of course it's kid friendly, right? And the kids actually really enjoy it because they can go and they can watch people put on the makeup to become the zombie. And then that makes the scary thing a lot less scary because you're seeing it be created, right? It's not this strange unknown thing. You're seeing someone's face being painted, or you're seeing someone put on the costume. And I think it gives a lot of kids, who would otherwise have been hesitant, this self-reliance that we talked about, or this kind of confidence that maybe some of the scary things we see in the world are not as scary as they initially seem. And so there are a lot of fun ways to sort of introduce yourself to that. Like, let's say you're not a reader and you don't want to watch a movie, go to a Halloween festival, like one that's kid-friendly, right? That's an interesting way to maybe get yourself into that kind of realm, at least initially.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds fun. And again, is very on brand with what you're doing.
Yeah.
Even though it's not academia, I think it's still on brand with morbid curiosity. And I think it helps a lot of people to see that it's not all scary. Like, at least for me, like sometimes it's just, it is scary because the way that they make these movies and these experiences, it's supposed to scare you. But when you understand the process and break it down, right, it's not as scary. So that's great to know. And thanks for coming on today and for sharing all these things. I don't know about audience. I really hope that they learned something today. I know for a fact that I will definitely seek out these things a bit more proactively every now and again. And maybe I'll report back how my resilience goes after that. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
You have been listening to Doing Well, the Wellbeing Science Insights Podcast, produced by the Wellbeing Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, we.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.